This is Hannibal and Piper here from the HannibalTV.com with another one of my Retro Wrestling Observer reviews. This time from this week, the week of August 12th, back in 1991, where Ric Flair was having a big contract dispute with WCW, ultimately ending on him sending him in WWE, where he actually debuted right here in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada, when he had that incident with Roddy Piper, September 9th, 1991. But let me tell you guys what the Observer had to say. This week, August 12th, 1991, there was a bunch of firsts in the World Wrestling Federation syndicated television shows, all related to Ric Flair. Vince McMahon mentioned both on the Superstars of Wrestling and Wrestling Challenge that the World Heavyweight Champion, the second World Heavyweight Champion, would be coming. And there was a vignette with Bobby Heenan on both shows talking about this. Meltzer says it's interesting because it's the first time WWF acknowledged and recognized a champion from another promotion since 1984, when Vince McMahon bought Georgia Championship Wrestling and for a short time recognized my old friend Les Thornton, who's passed away now, who was junior champion by then, and the Spoiler, who was national champion by then. But they apparently, Vince quickly had them beaten. And of course, Thornton stayed around for a long time as enhancement talent, and he was half of an agent. Really nice guy. Knew him from Calgary. He got me my first WWE tryouts. Recommended me to Dr. Tom Pritchard back in 2004. And by the way, he was the one that showed me the sugar hold. He was a great shooter. Anyways, Meltzer goes on to say, obviously, this is being done because McMahon must be extremely confident he can cut a deal with Flair shortly after September 1st, when he's officially allowed to negotiate once his WCW contract expires. And this is interesting because it never happened. Equally as obvious, by billing Flair as the other world champion, that Flair is being set up for a run with Hulk Hogan. Speculation is that the heel wrestlers will refer to Flair as the real world champion, while the face wrestlers will refer to Hogan as the real champion, provided everything happens as it appears it will. Flair will first be talked about by Heenan. True, that happened. Heenan will have Flair's title belt on his shoulders. Heenan will say that the man who owns this belt is Ric Flair, and that comparing this belt to Hulk Hogan's title is like comparing ice cream to horse manure. I remember how cool that angle was. They did drop the ball with that angle, but could you imagine like the AEW title showing up on WWE TV while CM Punk is still under contract or while MJF is still under contract? That's what it's the equivalent of today. Apparently, while all this was going on, WCW was still having meetings with Flair. Flair had a meeting this week back in 1991. Keep in mind, he debuted just a few weeks later in WWE. The WCW made a last-ditch effort to get Flair back in a meeting with Jack Petrick and Jim Herd at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in Atlanta, Georgia. Both sides signed confidentiality agreements not to discuss any of the contents of the meeting. Sources in WCW believe Flair was offered the job as booker. In fact, many WCW wrestlers and employees expected that Dusty Rhodes' days were numbered early in the week. Keep in mind, guys, there was a lot of heat between Dusty Rhodes and Ric Flair at this time. Dusty Rhodes, history paints Dusty Rhodes as an angel, the way WWE paints him, I guess, because of the positions that Dustin has in AEW and the position Cody has in WWE. But I mean, if you talk to wrestlers at the time, he was an egomaniac. He was one of the reasons that Crockett went out or was forced to sell to WCW. He was an extremely selfish booker, according to report. Even Billy Graham, his friend, said that he buried Billy Graham in NWA, had him lose to Sam Houston. Anyways, apparently Flair turned down whatever offer was made to him at this meeting. And then there was rumors that maybe Rhodes wouldn't be fired as booker. Apparently, Ric Flair had been fired on July 1st. Then they had the disastrous Great American Bash pay-per-view 2 weeks later, where Jim Herd and Dusty Rhodes, the booker at the time, came under heavy criticism both in and out of the company and wrestling communities. Herd is under contract until January, which we know, I don't think it lasted much longer past this, and Rhodes, his contract didn't expire till January 93. They were taking most of the blame for this Ric Flair situation. And apparently, um, they were mostly upset because before Flair left, he had been the focal point of a Turner Home Entertainment commercial designed to promote the show. According to Meltzer's sources, Patrick, who heads up the wrestling division, has given both Herd and Rhodes 2 weeks to come up with a plan of action for the remainder of 1991 that would turn the company's fortunes around. We know that sure as hell didn't happen. While speculation went wild during the week concerning both men's futures, it appears that Patrick won't be making any moves. Those close to the situation seem to feel that Herd is definitely safe until his end of his contract, which, again, this is August 91. His contract ended January 91. Rhodes's contract is apparently for $300,000 a year and would have to have his contract paid off if he were fired. This would cause a lot of explanations to the higher up in the corporate world, so it'd be harder to fire him. I know he was eventually relieved as booker. I don't know how soon after Bill Watts came in, but fairly soon after this. Vern and Greg Gagne were in the WCW offices this week. We know that Greg Gagne later got hired, but at this time, apparently there was supposed to be some type of syndication deal. I never heard that Vern got hired, but Greg Gagne was definitely an agent. Flair is legally unable to make any career moves until September 1st, unless he resigns with WCW. Apparently, he appeared at a fan convention in New York just a couple of days before SummerSlam 1991. And Jim Ross had reported on the WCW hotline that Flair would make a surprise appearance with WWF at the SummerSlam pay-per-view show. That makes no sense at all. I think that was just Jim Ross trying to sell hotline things, because obviously if his contract didn't expire till September, him appearing on the SummerSlam show would have caused a lot of legal situations. Meltzer goes on to say one would think there would be legal problems with Flair making an appearance at SummerSlam. Vince McMahon said that any discussions on how Flair would be programmed would be premature, considering he can't deal with it until September 1st. Other sources are saying that if Flair were to join Titan, and there's obvious enough confidence that he will to talk about him on television, his debut date would literally be at the mid-September TV tapings. And as I said, I was there September 9th, 91. Superstars. The next day he wrestled in Cornwall. Another taping. He beat Jim Powers. In the same arena where Great North Wrestling is going next year. The speculation is that Flair and Hogan would work a major house show run in the fall rather than hold off for the Invitable match at WrestleMania. We all know that house show run turned out to be a flop. They drew some good houses, but some horrible houses. The return match in San Francisco only drew 5,000 fans after a botched finish. Not a botched finish, a schmoz finish, the previous encounter. We know Hogan went on to face Sid at WrestleMania 8, and Flair fought Savage in a great match, but they definitely dropped the ball with the Flair Hogan feud doing it on house shows. This past Saturday, Joel Goodhart strongly hinted that Flair versus Terry Funk would headline his September 21st show in Philadelphia. I don't think that happened. Anyone that knows that can say it in the comments. So that's about all they have to say about the Ric Flair thing, but they go on to say that rumors, and this is interesting because Bill Watts ended up getting hired. So this is kind of related because obviously Jim Herd and Dusty Rhodes, I think, was demoted because I know he wasn't Booker when Bill Watts was the Booker when he took over. I'm sure he had assistants, but Jim Herd, his contract wasn't renewed. But while all this was taking place, Bill Watts began to surface again. He did an interview where he ridiculed WCW. He did this interview with Wade Keller on August 1st. And this interview virtually guarantees that he'll never be considered for a run in the company. Others who read this interview say it's almost a dare for WCW to hire Watts. So there you go. Apparently, Watts was upset because Herd in the spring of 1989, after George Scott was fired as WCW Booker, Bill Watts was offered $300,000 a year to be Booker. But Watts said, "Let's do it this way. I don't need a salary. Let's do it totally on incentives, on how much I cut your losses, how much your ratings go up. I want a piece of action on the television revenue on pay-per-views, anything that increases." Obviously, that didn't happen, but eventually Watts took over. And I do know this, as much as he was hated, he did cut losses significantly, and he wasn't given as much leeway as Eric Bischoff was. Apparently, according to reports that I've read, Bill Watts actually wanted to do live shows and be more competitive with Vince, but for whatever reason, he also wanted to get Hulk Hogan at one point. I know that, but like he wasn't given as much leeway with Turner. So maybe further down the line, Turner got frustrated when Bischoff came on. Bischoff could also be a better salesman and better at convincing Turner, but for whatever reason, Bill Watts wasn't given as much leeway as he wanted. Obviously, he made a lot of mistakes as well, but he did turn it around um, from where Herd had it. By the way, I did listen to an interview with Jim Herd where he claimed Flair was saying Lex Luger made 600,000 at the time Flair left, and Herd was saying Lex was only making 240,000 a year in '91, which I guess that Luger would have been signed to WCW as soon as it joined WCW. So he still would have been fairly green, but who knows if that's true that Herd was only making, or that Luger was only making 240,000. Arn Anderson says Ric Flair around the time he left WCW was making 600,000 a year. And he said that's his guess, that Flair, and of course they were best friends. And Anderson said that Herd wanted him to take a pay cut of about half to make about 350,000 a year, because Herd was under tremendous pressure to cut losses too, because WCW was losing a ton of money. Dayton, Ohio in the house. Demolition in the 2024 Hall of Fame. I agree. Victor Murphy, good morning from San Diego. Good afternoon here. I had a good workout today. For the guy asking if I'm doing well, I went back to the gym for the first time. I took my month off of the gym as the doctor's ordered. Was back in the gym 32 days later, actually, lifting weights. And I've been doing short runs, building up my runs. I am going to do a run this afternoon around 4 p.m. And I am supposed to be interviewing Jamie Dundee 7 p.m. tonight. I'm waiting for confirmation on that. But thanks for tuning in. This was an interesting time. I remember as a WCW fan, guys. I was a fan even during the Herd era. I loved WCW in the 90s. I liked WCW more than WWF. For whatever reason, I was absolutely, maybe because we got less of it. We didn't get the Saturday nights because TBS wasn't part of the Canadian cable packages back then. You had to have a special satellite to get TBS, so we only got the Power Hour. And I'd rent the pay-per-views from the video store. And sometimes the satellite companies would give you 2 weeks of TBS free, maybe 2 or 3 times a year. So you got WCW Saturday Night Main Event, and you felt spoiled. So WCW had more mystique to it because we got all the WCW shows. So I remember I was a huge Ric Flair fan. I still am. I don't know what he thinks I think of him, but I like Ric Flair. And when that belt showed up on WWE TV, I was like marking out like crazy. And that thing with Piper in Ottawa, September 9th, I think that was the only time Piper ever appeared for WWE in Ottawa that I can remember. That was like the biggest crowd, other than the time I saw Hulk Hogan wrestle Earthquake. That was the biggest crowd, September 9th, 91, in the Ottawa Civic Center that I'd ever seen um, for a wrestling show there. It was completely packed. Sid Justice versus The Undertaker was the main event. And Undertaker beat Sid Justice beat The Undertaker in a body bag match. Do you imagine that? Back in those days, thinking The Undertaker would have a bigger career than Sid, even though I was a fan of Undertaker and Sid, but like people would have thought Sid would have had the longer career. Anyways, guys, yes, Flair. What happened to the Greg Valentine interview? He pulled out of um, that Charlotte wrestling convention the other week. I forget what it's called, but it was going to be done through an agent of his, and he pulled out of the convention. I don't know what excuse he gave, but as I said, Jamie Dundee tonight. Jake the Snake is coming to Ottawa next month. I'm going to see if I can try and get a live interview with him when he's in town. Next time I talk to DDP, I'm going to bring it up. I know Rick Bassman is going to visit DDP next week, and Bassman is also going to restart his Talking Tough podcast on this channel imminently, like in the next few weeks. So thanks for tuning in. Thanks for your comments. See one more comment. Why is something crapping on me? I have no idea what you're talking about. I am feeling fine. I'm happy to be alive. I'm training and looking forward to my next wrestling match, November 4th in Renfrew, Ontario, Canada. It's going to be a lot of fun. It's motivating and good training motivation, and prepare for this.
Thank you for watching the Hannibal TV. Please like this video if you enjoyed it and click the subscribe button to not miss any of our latest shoot